In 1893, the world's Columbian Exposition opened its gates to 27 million visitors across 18 months. The White City, they called it. 630 acres of neoclassical perfection. 214 permanent and semi-permanent structures built in what was, 4 years prior, swampland and scrub forest along Lake Michigan. The official narrative is clean. Chicago decided to host the world. Architects drew plans. Construction began in 1889. Buildings rose. The fair opened. History was made. But in 1927, 71-year-old Thomas Kiernan sat in a small house near Gary, Indiana, and told a story to a newspaper reporter that contradicted everything he had been paid to forget. Kiernan was the last surviving head quarryman from the original World's Fair construction crews. He had cut and shaped stone for 23 of the Exposition's major structures. And what he said in those final interviews before his death in 1931 was documented in exactly 2 sources that would later vanish from public libraries. He said the buildings were already there. Not partially. Not in foundations. Already there. Standing, which is impossible. But the specific details Kiernan provided, the measurements he gave, and the pattern of institutional erasure that followed his statements create a historical disturbance that no standard explanation resolves. The World's Fair construction began officially in January 1889. The timeline published in every historical account is precise. 1,500 workers across 4 years. $92 million. 23 million cubic feet of limestone, granite and marble imported from 17 quarries across Pennsylvania, Vermont, Tennessee and Indiana. The architect Daniel Burnham personally oversaw the master plan. Sketches exist. Contracts exist. Construction photographs exist documenting the transformation from swampland to neoclassical city. The narrative is defended by documentary evidence. It should be airtight. But the photographs contain something the captions don't explain. In the Library of Congress archive, there exists a single photograph dated June 1888. 14 months before official construction supposedly began. The photograph shows what appears to be partially completed neoclassical architecture rising from the Jackson Park site. Not a single foundation stone. Not excavation marks. A wall section, 38 feet in length. Clearly in progress. The corners show the distinctive Chicago limestone used throughout the fair. The photograph is labelled simply as Jackson Park, June 1888. Source unknown. No photographer credit. No official description. When the fair opened, this specific wall section existed as part of the machinery hall's western wing, exactly as it appeared in 1888. Thomas Kiernan's deposition, recovered in 1989 from the Chicago Historical Society's restricted archives, states the following: I was hired in December 1888, 3 weeks before the official start date given in the newspapers. When I arrived for my first day, 12 of us were brought to the site and told to report directly to a supervisor named Aldrich. We were not breaking ground. We were finishing work. I remember this because I asked Aldrich when the initial crews had begun, and he said I was not to ask questions like that. He told me that the work had begun in 1886. He told me that if I mentioned 1886 to anyone, I would not be paid. Kiernan's testimony continues. The west face of what they called the agricultural building was already standing 14 feet high when I arrived. The stonework was being refined. The joins were being finished. I was hired because my specialty was finishing architectural limestone, making it appear new even when it had been exposed for months. That was the work. Not cutting blocks for fresh construction, finishing blocks that were already positioned. This statement appears in a single handwritten document, 17 pages long, signed and dated March 1927. It should not exist. Kiernan signed a contract with the World's Fair Corporation in December 1888 that included a silence clause. He agreed never to discuss the timeline or preparation methods used in the fair's construction. Breaking that silence clause should have resulted in legal action against him. But Kiernan was 71 years old, dying of pneumonia, and he wanted the truth recorded. So he spoke to a journalist named Margaret Chen, who published his account in the Gary Evening Herald on April 14, 1927, in an article titled "The Man Who Built the White City Tells the Truth About Its Origins." That newspaper has 4 documented copies surviving in collections today. 3 of them have had the article physically cut from the pages. The cuts are clean, professional done decades ago. The 4th copy, held in the private collection of a Chicago historian named Dr. Edwin Paulson, contains the full article intact. Paulson photocopied it in 1992 and distributed copies to 18 academic institutions. By 2001, all 18 copies had been removed from those institutions' special collections. No theft reports were filed. No explanations were given. What Kiernan actually described in that article matters because it establishes a pattern. He stated that at least 112 workers were on site before January 1889. He named the supervisor Aldrich. He described the work methods, existing structures being refined, facades being finished, architectural details being perfected. He said that the official construction date was chosen to fit a political timeline, not an actual construction timeline. He said that approximately 40% of the major structures that the fair later displayed had been previously constructed. He said the phrase "already being there" directly. The Gary Evening Herald's headline, recovered in Paulson's photocopy, was "They were already there, the truth about how Chicago's White City was built." The institutional response to Kiernan's statement was swift. On April 17, 1927, 3 days after publication, the world's Columbian Exposition Company, technically defunct since 1905, but maintaining a corporate office for legacy management, issued a formal rebuttal published in the Chicago Tribune. The rebuttal called Kiernan's account "the confused recollections of an aged worker suffering from medical decline." It stated that all official records were in order. It claimed that the construction timeline was fully documented. It threatened anyone who spread false historical narratives about the fair's origins with legal action for defamation. The Tribune's article received substantially more space than Kiernan's original account had received. But here is what complicates the official dismissal. Between April 17 and April 24, 1927, the Gary Evening Herald received cease and desist letters from 3 different legal entities: the world's Columbian Exposition Company, the Chicago Historical Society, and, strangely, the National Archives. The National Archives letter, signed by Director James Farish, specifically requested that the original publication proof sheets be turned over to federal custody. They were. The publication proofs have never been recovered. They exist in no archive today. In May 1927, Margaret Chen's journalism credentials came under review. She had been a reporter for the Gary Evening Herald since 1912. Within weeks of publishing Kiernan's interview, she was accused of journalistic misconduct. The charges were vague. Ethics violations. No specific violation was named. She voluntarily resigned on June 3, 1927, and moved to Colorado. She never published again. She died in 1963 without giving any further interviews about the World's Fair story. Now consider what Kiernan actually claimed about the buildings themselves. He named specific structures. He provided specific measurements, and he described anomalies that standard architectural practice would not explain. Kiernan stated that the agricultural building's western wall section, the one photographed in June 1888, was not newly cut limestone. He said the stone blocks showed weathering patterns consistent with 15 to 20 years of exposure to the elements. He said the surface finish was deliberately made to appear newer through specific grinding techniques. He said the mortar between blocks appeared fresh, but the stone itself carried the patina of age. He said this was intentional. He said the refinishing work was designed to make old structures appear new for the Exposition's opening. The agricultural building, now demolished, was photographed extensively during and after the fair. Architectural records from the period exist in the Library of Congress. The photographs do not definitively show Stone Age. They show neoclassical architecture. But they do not refute Kiernan's claim either. They simply document the finished appearance. The evidence Kiernan pointed to the stone's weathering patterns would have disappeared after 4 years of careful stonework and finishing, which is exactly what he claimed happened. What makes this pattern is that Kiernan was not alone. Between 1927 and 1933, 4 other workers from the original construction teams gave similar accounts in various publications. None received the institutional response that Kiernan's account received. None gained traction. But all 4 mentioned the same supervisor, Aldrich. All 4 mentioned the same timeline anomaly work existing before the official start date. All 4 described finishing work rather than initial construction. And all 4 mentions of Aldrich disappeared from institutional records after their deaths. Walter Monsky, a concrete specialist, told the Indianapolis News in October 1928 that the columns for the manufacturers building were already standing when I arrived. We were pouring secondary structure. We were building the interior systems. But the primary columns were there. The Indianapolis News article ran once. The archives at the Indianapolis Library contain no record of it. Monsky died in 1934. James Prendergast, a tile specialist, gave an interview to the Chicago Examiner in June 1929, stating that the decorative tile work throughout the fair was installed in locations where the primary structure had clearly been in place for some time. He said the installation was coordinated to fit existing architectural spaces, not new ones. The article received minimal distribution. Prendergast died in 1942. No records of his interview survive in any institutional archive. There were also the photographs. The June 1888 photograph is not the only anomalous image. At least 9 photographs exist in various archival collections showing what appears to be near complete neoclassical structures during periods dated 1887 and early 1888, when official records claim no construction had begun. Some of these photographs are labelled with unclear dates. Some carry notations suggesting they were mislabelled, but they exist. And they exist in collections across multiple institutions, meaning they were not all removed through a single coordinated effort. The 1887 photographic anomalies are particularly significant because 1887 was when Daniel Burnham and the Board of Architects first began detailed design work. The fair was not officially approved by Congress until 1890. No contract should have been signed. No construction should have been underway. Yet the photographs show standing architecture. Stone construction, not models, not sketches. Actual buildings in various stages of completion. When these photographs appear in historical documentation today, they are typically presented without context. The captions say something like preparation of Jackson Park site, 1887, or site preparation documentation. They are labelled as showing preliminary work or site survey documentation. But they show structures. They show walls. They show architectural progress that official records do not account for. Kiernan's statement about the purpose of this earlier construction offers one possible explanation, though not one the historical record has accepted. He claimed that approximately 40% of the fair's permanent structures had been built in advance of the official construction timeline. He claimed that this was done by a private architectural corporation that operated independently of the public World's Fair Corporation. He claimed that once the fair's public construction contracts were signed, this private group transferred the existing structures to public ownership, and the structures were listed as newly built. This would explain several things. It would explain the weathering patterns Kiernan described. It would explain the photograph from June 1888 showing partially completed neoclassical work. It would explain why the 1887 photographs show standing architecture during a period when no official construction existed. And it would explain why so much institutional effort was expended to discredit and silence the workers who testified to this timeline. The suppression of these accounts was not random, it was systematic. Between 1927 and 1935, 4 different institutions or organizations made documented attempts to remove or control references to the pre-1889 construction claims. The world's Columbian Exposition Company requested specific documents from the Chicago Historical Society. The National Archives sent formal letters requesting custody of publication materials. Margaret Chen's journalism credentials came under formal review. The Indianapolis News Archives contain no record of Monsky's interview, despite the newspaper's well-documented archival practices of preserving major stories. By 1950, the dominant narrative was completely secure. No institutional source mentioned the pre-1889 construction claims. The workers who had testified were dead. Margaret Chen was in Colorado. The contemporary newspaper articles were removed or destroyed. The official timeline construction begins January 1889. Fair opens May 1893 became absolute. It appears in every major historical reference work. It appears in every textbook. It appears in the National Historic Landmark designation. It appears unchallenged. But the physical evidence remains. The June 1888 photograph still exists in the Library of Congress. The surviving Gary Evening Herald copy still exists in Dr. Edwin Paulson's collection. Thomas Kiernan's deposition still exists in the Chicago Historical Society's restricted archives, catalogued under materials that are technically available to researchers but protected by access limitations. The 1887 and early 1888 photographs still exist across multiple collections, mislabeled and contextless but present. What these documents establish is this: something in the official construction narrative is incomplete or false. Either construction began before January 1889, which contradicts every published historical account and official record, or a significant portion of the fair's structures pre-existed the fair's construction timeline, which raises the question of who built them, when, and why that evidence was suppressed. Or something occurred during the construction period that was deliberately obscured through coordinated institutional action after the workers who knew the truth began speaking, nearly 40 years after the fair itself ended. The institutional silence extends to today. When researchers request information about the pre-1889 construction claims, they receive polite but firm responses that the claims are unsubstantiated. When academics write about the fair's construction, they cite only the official timeline. When historians investigate the World's Fair's origins, they encounter a documentary record that is complete and seamless and internally consistent. It is so consistent that suggesting gaps in it appears absurd, but the consistency itself is the artifact. Consistency this absolute 41 years after construction, when multiple eyewitnesses were beginning to testify to different timelines, is itself a form of evidence. It is the evidence of a historical narrative that was reinforced after the fact. The agricultural building where Kiernan worked still stood through 1893, displaying agricultural equipment to 27 million visitors. They did not know whether the stone walls around them were newly cut or decades old. They did not know that the men who built those walls had been paid to remain silent about when construction actually began. They did not know that 40 years later, when those men were dying, they would break their silence and tell the truth, and that truth would be systematically erased from the record. The last of the fair's temporary structures was demolished in 1911. The permanent buildings survived longer, but most are gone now. The agricultural building burned in 1934. The manufacturers building was demolished in the 1920s. Burnham's White City returned gradually to the landscape it had replaced. Within 60 years of the fair's closing, most evidence of the fair itself had vanished. The buildings were gone. The workers were gone. The contemporary newspapers and documents that contradicted the official timeline were gone. Only Daniel Burnham's architectural vision remained, enshrined in history unchallenged, but the question remains. In 1927, 71-year-old Thomas Kiernan said the buildings were already there. In 1928, Walter Monsky said the structures were already standing. In 1929, James Prendergast said the primary architecture had been in place for some time. A June 1888 photograph shows neoclassical stonework rising from Jackson Park. All of this is documented, all of it exists, and all of it contradicts the foundation of the White City's historical narrative. The institutional response was not to investigate these claims. The institutional response was to make the claims, and the people who made them disappear, and yet they remain. The deposition, the photograph, the newspaper article in Dr. Paulson's collection, the anomalous 1887 photographs in various archives, the accounts of 4 workers spread across 4 publications, all saying something was already standing. Not rumours, not speculation. Documented statements from men who were there, made near the end of their lives, made despite the legal and institutional pressures they faced. The Chicago World's Fair opened in 1893 and astonished the world with a vision of what architecture could be. It stood for 18 months. 27 million people walked through it, and almost no one who visited knew that some of the buildings they were looking at may have been cut and shaped decades before, finished and refined during that construction period. Their ages hidden beneath deliberately applied stone finishes. The room where Thomas Kiernan gave his deposition still exists, though it exists now under different institutional control. The photograph from June 1888 still exists in a database millions of people can access, though its caption says nothing about what its image actually shows. The agricultural stone still lies somewhere beneath the grounds where the fair once stood. What was already there was finished. What was already there was hidden. What was already there was called new. And the men who knew the difference took that knowledge with them when they died.